been doing a bit of reading lately, namely this and this. And the thought dawned on me that, although a relative newcomer to the channel, this P-51 Minié rifle had its very baptism of fire during one of the conflicts talked about in these books. And I thought, what better way to explore the very earliest days of the use of the rifle musket than by doing just a little bit of field firing. The Cape Frontier Wars are a little-remembered series of early to mid-Victorian campaigns that began during the era of Brown Bess and ended during the era of the Martini Henry, concluding just before the Zulu War of 1879. If one were to categorize these series of campaigns, the term bush war might be most appropriate. Never large in scale, but always fraught with close-range ambushes and attacks. The nature of this type of fighting forms an excellent backdrop for this type of project. And now, without further delay, I bring to you the P-51 Minié rifle and the action at the Dennehoutkloof. Got a problem with that? I hope I pronounced that right. While not at all an exhaustive study of the conflict per se, the complex nature of the Cape's eastern frontier makes necessary some form of context. There were a total of 9 Cape Frontier Wars fought between 1779 and 1879. Initially involving Boer frontiersmen and the Xhosa people, by 1811 and the coming of the Fourth War, the British Empire became involved after the ceding of the Cape Colony by the Dutch. This would continue to be the case until the Ninth War came to an end in 1879. Much of the fighting of the 8th Cape Frontier War centered around seesaw control over the frontier, with Xhosa attacks on forts, farms, and settlements, and the resultant British expeditions to find and defeat them. There were other clashes in this time frame, namely the Anglo-Basuto War of December 1852 in present-day Lesotho. Fighting in the Cape was very much dominated by the topography and the environment. The steep hills and mountains, dense forest, along with open plains and areas of farmland or scrub dictated the tactics used. The British Army was very much a product of its time, and all the normal conventions of the mid-Victorian army were of course in place. Close order formations, maneuver, and procedures were at the foundation of infantry tactics. But due to the nature of the ground and the habits and capabilities of the enemy, and the generally small numbers available, the proliferation of extended order or skirmishing tactics was necessary. The 1850s were still the era of the so-called flank companies, the Grenadier and Light Company. While perhaps in formal settings, the Light Company could be relied on to provide the skirmishing capability within the battalion, this luxury was not at all sufficient for campaigning in South Africa. To that end, most, if not all, companies of any given battalion were exercised in these extended order tactics, and the countless actions, skirmishes, and even formal attacks would feature these tactics employed by whichever company was required to do the job. The Xhosa could be relied upon to use the ground to their advantage, setting ambushes and mounting attacks from deep in the bush. The Xhosa were a people who had settled in the Eastern Cape in antiquity. They were made up of a loose association of 3 main groups, whose culture coalesced around a common language. From the Dutch settling of the Cape in the 1600s, and subsequent British control over the former Dutch territory, it was perhaps a foregone conclusion that war would be somewhat commonplace. By the 1840s, the Xhosa had evolved militarily by the inclusion of a large number of firearms, adding to their effectiveness. While never wholly equipped that way, they made excellent warriors, and their obvious local knowledge was always an advantage. The Xhosa were never as homogeneous or as organized as the Zulu armies of the 1870s, but it could be said that those forces only evolved into what they became, due in large part to the Xhosa's experience earlier in the century. Generally older, flintlock arms gradually supplanted the more traditional throwing spears, and by 1850 it could be assumed that between 60 and 70% of Xhosa warriors had a musket. Colonel Mike Snook, author of the Cape Warriors series, made this interesting observation. A musket-armed Xhosa warrior was not markedly less well equipped, per se, than a British regular. In the bush, his knowledge of the ground, speed of maneuver, and his agility conveyed a considerable advantage. While issues of poor musketry and even poorer maintenance and ammunition supply were a natural accompaniment in such circumstances, the Xhosa of the 8th Cape Frontier War were indeed formidable, sometimes numbering in the thousands in any given battle space. The 74th Highlanders arrived in South Africa in 1851. One of many Highland regiments of the era, it had the peculiarity of wearing trews, as did their cousins of the 71st and 72nd Highlanders, which, in the Victorian era, were considered no less Highland than the kilt. They wore the standard infantry red coatee, with the usual Highland distinctions of wings and shorter tails at the rear. The 74th wore white facings, and a bell-topped shako with dicing, much like the 71st. Lamont was the regimental tartan, which was simply government tartan, with a white overstripe. While this was the full dress of the regiment, and was worn in all temperate climates, conditions in the Eastern Cape would see a significant change to the look of the regiment, while on active service. Due to some shrewd decision-making by their colonel, John Fordyce, an order of dress far more suited was adopted. While it had been commonplace for regiments to use various items of dress, undress, and even locally produced items of uniform and equipment, Lieutenant Colonel Fordyce eschewed even these concessions, and went one step further. The men's ship smocks, a simple light garment in canvas or duck, which, as its name alludes, was issued and worn while at sea on the troop ship, were taken in and dyed with mimosa bark to turn their typically white color to a shade of drab. This has been represented as a light brown shade with an ochre overtone in period artwork, and faded even lighter with use. Nevertheless, this eminently practical garment proved to be popular and stands as the first use of what would later be known as khaki, later in the century, predating its widespread use in India during the Mutiny. This was all due to the foresight of the colonel. Equipment followed the usual South African practice of the use of a locally produced belly pouch, belt, and frog in untanned leather, instead of, but sometimes in addition to, the normal 60-round ammunition pouch and bayonet on their usual crossbelts. The undress Kilmarnock bonnet was worn, with a leather peak stitched to its front, and the awkward box knapsack was left behind in the field, and in its place, a simple arrangement of bundled greatcoat, blanket, and mess tin, secured with the knapsack straps, was carried in its place, known colloquially as simply a blanket pack. Added to these were the usual haversack and water bottle for the required sustainment in the field. Incidentally, there are no references to the use of any kind of cap pouch, strange, as of course by this time all troops were armed with percussion weapons. I made a simple version to be worn next to the belly pouch in lieu of the presence of a more historically accurate suggestion. With these items, the regimental trews of Lamont tartan, often with patches of leather sewn on for repair or reinforcement, were worn, and locally produced veldschoen replaced the normal army boot. Put together, this practical and serviceable uniform stood the 74th apart from other regiments in the Cape, who continued to wear more traditional colors, be they red or rifle green, in the bush. While items of kit and equipment may be of passing interest, it is, of course, the arm carried by some in South Africa, which is the focus of this video. 500 examples of the P-51 were delivered, split evenly between depots at Grahamstown and King Williamstown in May of 1852, and were soon issued to infantry regiments in the Cape. The P-51 was clearly a transitional weapon, bridging the eras of the 75 caliber smoothbore Brown Bess and the later small-bore .577 Enfield rifle musket. Its manufacture, less the rifling, was typical of the era, with George Lovell's hallmarks present throughout, namely the bayonet catch and the keys to secure the barrel. It was .702 in caliber, thus being able to use the round-ball musket ammunition in a pinch. It had 4, later 3 grooves of 1 in 78-inch pitch. Its lock and general appearance was very similar to the contemporary P-42 percussion musket of the infantry, and only the rifling and the conspicuous rear sight betrayed its true characteristics. These were considerable. While infantry armed with the percussion musket would have no greater advantage over their Napoleonic ancestors as it pertains to range and rate of fire, the P-51 took the conventional 100-yard range of the musket and blew that paradigm out of the water. The P-51 was sighted to 900 or 1,000 yards, and while hitting a man individually at that range was out of the question, massed or even less dense collective fire could tell against large formations or areas. Closer in, say 200 to 500 yards, the power held by a single man was manifest. Not only was the weapon a rifle, but it used a wholly new type of ammunition. Building on the developments in France by the likes of Delvigne and Minié, the service ammunition for the P-51 used a conoidal or tapered bullet, but later a cylindroconoidal bullet took its place. This featured an iron cup set into its hollow base to ensure expansion into the grooves of the rifling. It would prove to be an imperfect design, but for the time being gave the infantrymen great power on the battlefield. The methods of carrying this ammunition in South Africa proved to be rather diverse. The 74th Highlanders seemed not to have used the issue 60-round pouch and preferred the belly pouch as described, with at least a small reserve kept in the haversack. From there, the packet was unwrapped and the individual cartridges placed in the ammunition pouch. Details on this particular item are very scarce, but it would seem that it held 20 or so rounds and thus would make it very similar to the later 1855 version issued for use with the Enfield rifle musket, albeit somewhat larger to accommodate the increased dimensions of either 69 caliber musket or 702 caliber Minié ammunition. Loading of the rifle was somewhat of a departure from the methods used by musket-armed troops. The cartridge was withdrawn from the pouch, and the powder end was opened by tearing it in the teeth. The powder was then poured into the barrel. The cartridge with the bullet inside was reversed, and the bullet end inserted into the muzzle, inserted as far as the bullet only. The remainder, consisting of the powder cylinder, was snapped off, leaving the bullet with its iron cup surrounded by a lubricated paper patch in the muzzle. This was of course rammed home and seated with 2 slight taps, after which a cap was placed on the nipple, making the weapon ready to fire. This was the very earliest days in the use of the rifle musket, and methods and tactics were still to be worked out. The commander in the Cape, Lieutenant General the Honourable George Cathcart, who would later be killed on the field of Inkerman, issued a general order in 1852. This outlined the scheme by which the P-51 would be employed. They were issued at a rate of 6 per infantry company. Officers commanding battalions would select these men based on shooting ability, one of whom would be an NCO. Duly told off, they would take their place in the company as would otherwise be expected, ensuring that no 2 would form in the same file. Thus distributed, they would form an organic capability within every company and would be deployed by word of command from their company commander. This illustration of an infantry company will serve to demonstrate the concept. Shown here deployed in line, the employment of the P-51 men could be executed from any formation, close or extended order, in line of march, or even from the environs of a camp. Upon the appropriate word of command, in this case, marksman to the right, the P-51 men would deploy thus. Standing in ranks in their usual positions within the company, they would simply break ranks and move with best dispatch to the indicated position. There, under the aforementioned NCO, they would assemble, deploy, and engage the enemy according to the wishes of the company commander. Firing at specific targets, or at long range, would probably have been the primary tasks intended for these men. As mentioned, the P-51 men could be deployed from any formation, and, perhaps most commonly, extended order would provide the foundation and support for any foray. Information on training with the P-51 in South Africa remains very rare. Fortescue, in his History of the British Army, gave some details as to target practice and hence the capabilities of the rifle. It stands to reason that some training did occur. The modified loading drill, known as the platoon exercise, setting of the sights, aiming drill, and target practice would have had to take place at some point. Although, of course, not generally armed with the rifle, the Army did hold some corporate knowledge regarding the use of rifles and shooting at extended ranges. Notwithstanding the modified loading drills of its platoon exercise, perhaps this figured in the introductory training on the P-51. And while on the subject of training, much use of the kneeling position occurred during the filming of this project. Be it known that the kneeling position in the early 1850s was, as it had been for many decades, one in which the body remained upright, and, when the weapon was brought to the present, the back was straight and the weapon remained unsupported, held by the arms only. Perhaps in a simple reversion to my muscle memory, and thorough lack of attention to this minutiae, I am guilty of using the later technique of sitting on the heel and using the elbow to support the rifle upon the knee. Incidentally, this very change occurred in 1854 as a result of experiments carried out at the newly instituted School of Musketry at Hythe, under the supervision of its commandant, Colonel Hay. This was done for obvious reasons that any shooter today could easily point to, the latter being infinitely more stable and eminently more suitable for the greatly enhanced capabilities of the rifle over its smoothbore predecessor. This is very much a return to the field firing videos that have been published in the past. It therefore is not some sort of in-depth examination of a particular battle or action, but rather a course of fire set up to put the P-51 through its paces, so to speak. Added to this are quite obviously reasonable facsimiles of the appropriate kit and clothing to make the experience more meaningful and perhaps just a bit more interesting to the viewer. The P-51 arrived in South Africa towards the end of the 8th Cape Frontier War and was used in its closing months, with active campaigning coming to a close by October 1852. Further expeditions against the Basutos occurred in that same year during the month of December. To that end, the historical setting for this shoot shouldn't be seen as being definitive, but rather merely atmospheric. Now, it is perhaps a bit fanciful that in these circumstances, loading is done in full view of the, quote, enemy. The perils of a one-man show, I suppose. In reality, a sudden engagement of a scout, for instance, would in reality be followed up by the remainder of the accompanying party, 4 or 6 shots in rapid succession. A man would simply not be alone in these kinds of circumstances. We can see here the use of the cap pouch, as mentioned, perhaps a bit ahistorical. Possible alternatives may have had a supply carried in the ammunition pouch. It's very hard to convey the activity of a close-quarter engagement. Action could come at any turn, especially in the closer confines of a defile or track. In such circumstances, and at such close range, the P-51 would not have a marked advantage over the percussion musket. At greater range, of course, say that over 100 yards, obviously the percussion musket would begin to lag behind in its capabilities. The use of the prone position was not common in this era, but it did, in the context of skirmishing, occur, and was a prescribed method in the drill book. While it was recommended that loading take place from the kneeling position, loading could also be accomplished from the prone, or rather supine position. Here, a field expedient using the berm is performed. Far and away, the most awkward aspect of this kind of evolution is positioning the weapon such that it affords a reasonable angle to pour the powder down the barrel. In addition, ensuring the muzzle is low enough to facilitate ramming is also not always achieved in moments of inattention. Moving columns of troops through the bush was an exhaustive business. Not only could the terrain be problematic, but the distances involved and the necessary supplies added to the plight of all ranks. It was no wonder that reduced scales of equipment were prescribed, including the blanket pack and the lighter, locally produced pouches and belt. From my experience here, this order of dress certainly lived up to its billing. Perhaps, though, if ammunition requirements were not reduced, the apparent lack of capacity in the belly pouch and haversack would certainly hamstring troops so equipped, if stuck into a prolonged fight. When one examines the artwork associated with this conflict, the impossibly close environs make for a sobering ponder. The 74th Highlanders, though not yet equipped with the P-51, fought a series of actions in an area northwest of Fort Beaufort, known as the Dennehoutkloof. There, they experienced some of the most bitter fighting of the campaign. At Crumey Heights in September 1851, and again in the headlands overlooking the Dennehoutkloof in November. In the latter expedition, Colonel Fortis himself, acting as brigadier, fell, leading his men in action. As you will have noticed, I have taken the liberty of abridging some of the loading sequences. While an enjoyable aspect of the shooting, it is not perhaps the most riveting to watch again and again. The P-51 and my ammunition in particular performed well enough during the project. Like its later cousin, the P-53, so much depends on the right mix of components: the paper, the bullet, and the base cup. My combination leaves 2/1000ths windage, and thus loading repeatedly, using my usual seasonal mix of beeswax and shortening, there was no issue with fouling. Knowing the rifle and where it shoots at given ranges is still, however, a journey I am traveling. Loading from the kneeling position was very much a prescribed evolution during this era. Predominantly used for skirmishing, it was performed two different ways depending on which rank the man belonged to. Here, as I am by myself, I chose to load as a front rank man. This involved bringing the weapon around the front of the body and placing it at the left side, sling uppermost. Admittedly, the muzzle should have been somewhat lower than shown here, but the overall concept is soundly demonstrated. There was an accompanying rear rank version, which we will get to later. The P-51 is one of the jewels in the Channel's armory. For me, it holds a special place, as not only is it in exceptional condition, but it holds such an important place in history. Its service life wasn't long, and its technology wasn't the state of the art beyond a couple of years. But as an introductory arm, it kick-started the British Army's transition to rifled weapons. Between 1852 and 1854, it would be issued on the basis of 100 per battalion, integrating a much more precise and long-range capability within the unit. However, war with Russia was looming. The timely decision was made to go all in, as it were. Thousands of P-51s were withdrawn from the infantry battalions across the army, and from there concentrated in the battalions earmarked for the Black Sea. Famously, 4 out of 5 divisions in the Crimea would be so armed, leaving just one, the 4th Division, to go to war with its P-42 smoothbore muskets. Perhaps somewhat ironically, the 4th Division was commanded by George Cathcart, the man who issued the very first tactical direction on the use of the rifle musket back in 1852 during its introduction in South Africa. It is fascinating, to me at least, the steps taken by the Army in this transitional era. Unsure initially of how to employ the P-51, limited schemes to test and evaluate its impact on battle, and how best to utilize it eventually led to the decision to fully embrace the coming age of the rifle. The Army would never look back. When one reads the accounts of battles as found in Volume 2 of Cape Warriors, one cannot help but remark on the unique characteristics of campaigning in that part of the world. Now, admittedly, Colonel Snook may know a thing or two in writing about battle, but the attention he pays to these relatively minor actions is engrossing. Here, he quotes from the account of Lieutenant John Corrigan on the death of Colonel Fortis. We began the action at sunrise, a little before 6 o'clock. Just as the battle began, I was sent back to the rear in order to bring up the artillery. When I returned with the guns, we found the enemy in a strong position amongst a number of high rocks. The guns opened up on them, and 2 companies of our regiment moved off to storm the position. The colonel, in the meantime, remained with the guns, watching the storming party. I, of course, stayed with them. When our men got within musketry range of the enemy's position, they had such a tremendous fire opened upon them that they could not advance up the rocks, but were obliged to take cover behind some bush and stones in the best manner they could, and fire from thence upon the enemy. When the colonel saw them halt, he immediately ordered up some more troops to reinforce them, and went along with the reinforcements himself. When he got up to where our companies were, I never felt anything like the number of bullets that were flying around us. How they missed any of us seems to me the most extraordinary thing. I actually felt the wind of some of the balls. They passed so close to me. I know I had a sort of feeling that if I'd put out my hand, it would have been hit. As soon as the colonel got up with the reinforcements, he ordered the men to advance again. We were all obliged to dismount at this place, as the ground was so bad we could not ride. The men then advanced again, but were obliged to stop. I was standing beside the colonel at this moment, and he turned to me to give me an order. While he was speaking to me, in the middle of his sentence, he gave a sort of convulsive spring and fell forward on his face. When we raised him up, we found that a bullet had entered just below his right breast and gone out close to his spine. We put him on a stretcher and took him away to the rear. He was almost insensible from the time he received the wound until he expired. He did not seem to know any of us. He was, I suppose, one of the finest soldiers that ever led a regiment into action, and he was as good and kind a commanding officer as he was personally brave and fearless as a soldier. We have got an immense deal of praise as a regiment for the way in which the 74th behaved that day. But that is very little consolation to us after the loss we have sustained. As mentioned, the use of extended order was commonplace in all companies and battalions in South Africa. This system was based on the file. Come on! 2 men, 1 front rank and 1 rear rank. While in close order, the files would be quite close to each other, the standard 2-rank line. But in extended order, 6 paces was the default spacing between files. When ordered to commence firing, often by bugle call, the front rank man would present and immediately begin to load. Once he had done so, the rear rank man, who had been waiting and covering his front rank man, would himself present, and the rotation would continue indefinitely until ordered to cease fire. Thus, a rolling continuous fire all along the extended line would occur, while always keeping half the men with a loaded weapon. Here we see a demonstration of how a file might operate. The first thing to consider is that they are not strictly speaking formed by the book. However, when the order to commence firing was given, there was direction for the rear rank man to, quote, disengage from his front rank man, to enable him to more easily load and better cover the front. This demonstration has perhaps taken this concept to the extreme, as in disengaging, the rear rank man has taken up a position beside and up higher on the berm. Please excuse this flagrant deviation from the drill. It was done, however, to better exemplify the positions and flow of the engagement. I would draw your attention to the method of loading used by the rear rank man. Here, while ordinarily positioned behind his front rank man, the rear rank man has rotated his weapon so that the muzzle points rearward, and the butt is placed to his front. Thus, When formed as a file in a more conventional example, the front rank man loaded on the left, whilst the rear rank man loaded on the right. This has, in other projects, been demonstrated before. Firing this way could be combined with movement, either advancing or retiring. Generally, forward movement prescribed loading on the move, with the line kept generally together, though with the files moving semi-independently. In retirement, a system of leapfrogging was used, with the ranks moving back through each other after delivering their fire. It is recorded that the 74th were often referred to, or perhaps taunted, as tortoises by their Xhosa adversaries. Perhaps this is in relation to the combination of dyed ship smocks and the regimental trews, whose pattern, some might say, mimics that found on the back of a tortoise. Suffice it to say, there exists a considerable body of art depicting the 74th on campaign in South Africa, all of which features this novel uniform. In the not inconsiderable amount of time I spent wearing both the clothing and equipment spread out over 3 different outings, I must say that Colonel Fortis was onto something. The smock was found online, advertised as an artist's smock, and I dyed it from a light taupe color to the shade of ochre we see here. Perhaps this represents a well-worn example, faded from the generally darker shade with grey overtones that mimosa tends to yield. The blanket pack proved to be quite comfortable and typically stayed put and out of the way. Its relatively lightweight and compact nature kept it steady on the back, and the positioning of the mess tin kept it from contacting the back of my head, even when using the prone position. The haversack and water bottle are 2 items that always seem to migrate about the body with even the slightest activity. I was somewhat surprised that the constant fiddling and repositioning usually required was to a large extent absent. The bayonet proved to be a bit more of a distraction, especially when adopting any position lying down. I did take extra care to ensure that it was properly positioned so as to limit any undue wear and tear. It is, after all, and especially the scabbard, a very rare beast indeed. Incidentally, this turned out to be a bit of an atmospheric moment, as here the mound that I chose to lie behind was in fact an anthill, and I found myself covered in the little buggers. The use of the belly pouch was quite familiar to me, though it was quite novel in the era. Expense pouches were first delivered in 1855 during the Crimean War, but didn't become generally universal until the Mutiny. Its position on the belt was convenient but not overly bulky, despite the somewhat larger dimensions as mentioned earlier. Sometimes there comes an instance when you can feel the practice getting away on you. It's at these moments when you realize there is but one option. So, there you have it, the action at the Dennehoutkloof. I hope that you enjoyed this project as much as I did making it. The P-51 got put through its paces, and I learned a fair bit about its nuances, but most of all, I hope this conveyed the history and background of the arm and its era in an interesting and meaningful way. The P-51 has a few more duties to attend to, and record of these will eventually be published here. The main references used for this project were Colonel Snook's excellent 2-volume series, Cape Warriors. Clearly written with a soldier's eye for detail, and accompanied by period artwork, a host of specially commissioned illustrations, and on-the-ground photos with annotations. They are a must for study of this often forgotten series of Victorian campaigns. They are available, along with all your Cape Frontier wargaming needs, at Perry Miniatures. Also, the works of Major Brett Gibbons, in particular the Destroying Angel and the English cartridge, both of which feature much detail and history of the development of the P-51 and its ammunition, and how it began the first revolution on the battlefield since the coming of the flintlock and socket bayonet. And finally, the drill book of the era, the 1847 Infantry Manual. Though not inclusive of references to the P-51, these would come later in the 1854 edition, it does nevertheless lend much clarity to the way the infantry in the late 1840s and early 1850s fought and maneuvered. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. For more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page. What was once Utreon is now Player. It still remains a good alternative to YouTube and Patreon, as those platforms have become rather troublesome for content as found on this channel. May I suggest following British muzzleloaders there as well. If you'd like to view British muzzleloaders and many other channels in an ad-free environment free from the content restraints of YouTube and other platforms, then I might suggest you head on over to History of Weapons and War, where you can subscribe and find this channel and many like it, presented as they should be, all in one place.